Welcome to another episode of Mexican in the Kitchen. Today we're learning how to make this. This is a concha. This is my first time trying this, but it's one of those that I've grown eating this. This is very common. Every bakery you go to, at least in my city, you will find at least this bread. It's one of those that even if it's a small bakery, they have to make this. So it's very sweet layer, very fluffy bread on the inside. Very simple, but very delicious flavor. Like most people will love this kind of thing, and I think it also looks pretty. If you are not used to Mexican bread, this is one that's definitely one to try and impress anyone you have over. So I'm going to show you how to make this. This is the first time I'm trying this, so I have to do some adjustments, but you will see the video and I hope you like it.
First, we need some milk. I'm using 3/4 of a cup or 180 milliliters. First, we need to activate the yeast, and for that, our milk has to be at 42 degrees Celsius or 107.6 Fahrenheit. I would aim to be a bit higher, maybe 1 degree higher than the minimum. If you don't have a thermometer, you can warm your milk and hope for the best. Anyway, you will notice if the yeast doesn't get activated. In Finland, and I think in Mexico, these packages of dry yeast are 11 grams, so I'm using one. I think in the US they're smaller, they're 7 grams, so if that's the case, you might need to use 1.5. This recipe calls for 4 cups, around half a kilo of flour, and from that measurement we're going to take 3 tablespoons and add it to our yeast just to activate it. This recipe also calls for 3/4 of a cup or 150 grams of sugar, and from that measurement I'm going to take 1 tablespoon and add it to our yeast. At this point we're going to mix everything together. We want to make sure everything comes together nicely, and after that we're going to take this, set it on a warm place, and wait for about 20 minutes. You can cover this with some plastic and set it on a warm and sunny place. Right now it's a bit cold in Finland, so what I did was to take it next to the window, next to one of the radiators, and that helped it keep warm. The way you will notice if the yeast was activated or not is that you will notice some bubbles and it will start growing in size. This is the result after 20 minutes. As you can see, it's a big fluffy foam. Now for the buns, I'm going to use the rest of the flour. Remember, this recipe calls for 500 grams or 4 cups of flour, but we already used some of that for feeding our yeast. I'm also adding the rest of the sugar. Remember, 150 grams or 3/4 of a cup minus what we use for the yeast. I am using 140 grams of butter, and remember keeping this outside of the fridge for a bit just so it softens. I am adding 2 eggs, and I will add an extra yolk. I'm also adding about 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. I am also using a splash of vanilla extract. This is a bit over a teaspoon, but of course how much you use depends on how strong or concentrated the one you are using is. Finally, I am adding the yeast we prepared before, and with this we can start mixing everything together. Personally, I am using a stand mixer because this kind of doughs take quite long to knead. It's quite a lot of work. If you use a hand mixer with some dough hooks, it will also work. It's a bit more work on your arm, but you can still make it quite okay. If you decide to knead this by hand, of course, you can get the same result, but it will take about half an hour, 25 minutes, and it's quite a lot of work on the arms. Whatever method you use, just be patient. You might feel like this dough is going nowhere and it's just not coming together, but resist the urge to add more flour. Even with the mixer, it reminded me of the Day of the Dead bread, where it just looks like it's too liquid and it's never going to come together, but eventually after a lot of kneading, it will start to get some texture and the dough consistency that we're looking for. Having said that, I am using a KitchenAid, 20 minutes on number 2, and this dough was not quite there, and by 20 minutes you should start to see the dough coming together. So at that point I sprinkle a bit more flour. The consistency we're looking for is the dough has to be elastic, it has to come off the bowl but start climbing the hooks, and the most important thing is that when you touch it, it doesn't quite stick to your hands. After adding 1 more tablespoon of flour, this started to come together. As you can see, it was not quite there, so it still took 5-10 more minutes of kneading, and after that the dough was ready. Once my dough was ready, I moved it to a bowl. This bowl was oiled before just so it doesn't stick. I'm going to cover this and I'm going to let it rest on a warm place. We need to let the dough rest for 2 to 3 hours, so in the meanwhile I'm going to prepare the sweet layer that we are going to lay on top of our conchas. To be honest, the buns are good, but that layer brings the whole bread to a different level. For this, I am using 3/4 of a cup or 150 grams of butter, 150 grams of powdered sugar, 150 grams of wheat flour. Here, I guess it depends on what you use. This recipe, you can use butter, you can use some shortening. Personally, the butter I used was way too soft, so in this case, the dough was not coming together. This has to get the consistency of a dough that you can knead and play with. My best guess is that shortening doesn't get as soft when you knead it, so in this case, it started to become like a paste more than a dough, and if you happen to be in the same situation, just add the same amount of flour and powdered sugar and just keep adding until you get the proper texture. Before I adjusted the quantities and got the right texture, I divided the mix in half and I added some cocoa powder to one. For the plain one, you can add some vanilla extract, vanilla sugar, you can also add some food colorings, you can also add some other extracts, play with it, make different colored conchas, different flavors, and just make them your own. The texture we are looking for in this case is like a Play-Doh. While we wait for the dough to be ready, I'm going to cover this with some plastic and just throw it into the fridge so it gets a bit more firm. This is now the right texture, and at this point we just have to wait for our dough to be ready. I have waited my dough to be ready, and at this point I'm going to sprinkle some flour on my working table and I'm going to bring my dough. As you can see, the dough is quite fluffy, it has grown quite a lot, it has a lot of air inside. This dough doesn't need a lot of kneading at this point, I'm just going to fold it gently, and that's how I'm going to knead it for about 2 to 3 minutes. Once I have kneaded the dough for a bit, I'm going to cut it into 8 equal pieces. A lot of the recipes I checked call for 8 pieces with this amount. Personally, I would make maybe 12, end up with smaller breads and maybe more to share. Once we have the 8 pieces, all we have to do now is make them round. For making them round, one of the easiest ways is using one hand, putting it on the table and just gently roll them. Just keep some light pressure, keep circular motions, and eventually this will end up nice and round. Once you're ready with one, continue with the rest. Most of the recipes I checked call for oil or grease on a baking sheet, but personally I find baking paper way easier and I found no problems with it. So you can use whatever you prefer. Personally, I'm using the baking paper and just setting all my bread on top of that. You have to keep in mind that these are still going to grow quite a bit, so don't get them too close to each other. I tried to make 4 on each tray and I think that's enough. Now that our buns are on the baking sheet, we can get the dough we made from the fridge. This is a tortilla press. If you don't have one, don't worry, you can use a rolling pin or even a chopping board on your counter. We will use it just as we make tortillas. We put some plastic sheet and then the dough in between. Close it, press a bit, just enough so this becomes flat. You don't want to make it too thin because otherwise it won't come off the plastic easily. Now we can take one of the sheets off, then move it to our hand and just slowly and carefully remove the plastic. If your dough has the right consistency and you do it carefully, then you will end up with a nice round layer. Now we can take it to our bun, just lay it gently on top of it, press gently, you don't have to do a lot of pressure. You can use a knife to remove some of the leftover that's on the sheet, but you don't have to, it will come off easily after. Now I have this cutter, this is the traditional shape, it's a seashell, because that's what concha means. It only needs some gentle pressure and it will give it the shape. If you don't have one, you can use a pizza cutter, you can use a knife, or whatever you prefer. This is the traditional shape, but of course, as with the colors and the flavors, you can play with it and just make whatever pattern you like. Once these are done, we are going to wait for about 20 minutes, just let it rest and it will still grow a bit. I'm not sure how much you can tell from the video, but these have grown quite a lot. These have been resting for 25 minutes. You can tell by the size, but also by the space in between the topping. You can tell here in the chocolate ones especially, there is some space, which means it has grown. I have my oven preheated at 200 Celsius, that's about 392 Fahrenheit. When I put my conchas in, I'm going to turn it down to 180 Celsius, that's about 356 Fahrenheit. Time might vary, it's between 12 and 18 minutes depending on your oven. Honestly, the result was way better than I expected. These were not that hard to make. Of course, it takes some time, but they taste delicious, they smell awesome, and they look very pretty. It's probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever made. Wouldn't you love to have one of these on a cold day with a hot chocolate on the side?
This is the end result, as I showed you at the beginning. I brought a plate because I'm going to make a mess when I do this, but I wanted to show you the end result. This is very fluffy. When it breaks, it is very fluffy on the inside. It's very nice. This is a bit of a, well, same texture as hojaldras, like Day of the Dead bread kind of thing. Very fluffy, a bit moist. That's how I like it. If you have it straight away, it's very nice. Otherwise, of course, it starts drying with as the time goes by. But if you have it fresh, there's not many things that are better than this. So I hope you like it. Press like, subscribe, activate the bell, all those kind of things, and see you in the next one.